The coffee cup trembled in Mrs. Peterson's weathered hands as she watched the familiar figure storm through the door of Maple Street Café. Around her, conversations stopped mid-sentence and smiles faded from faces. Even the cheerful morning bustle seemed to freeze as every person in the room recognized the expensive suit and cold, calculating eyes of the man they all feared. Richard Blackwell had arrived, and everyone knew their peaceful morning was about to be ruined. The cafe door swung open with such force it rattled the bell above it. Richard Blackwell strutted in like he owned the place, which, according to rumors, he was trying to. At 52, he wore his wealth like armor. A $1,000 suit, Italian leather shoes, and a Rolex that cost more than most people made in a year. His cold gray eyes swept the room, and conversations stopped mid-sentence. "Where's my usual table?" he barked at Jenny, the longtime waitress who had been working there for 15 years. Jenny's hands trembled as she pointed to the corner booth. It's occupied right now, Mr. Blackwell. But I can. I don't care if it's occupied." Richard's voice boomed across the cafe. "Tell whoever's sitting there to move. Now!" The elderly couple at the corner table, Mr. and Mrs. Peterson, both in their 70s, looked up with frightened eyes. They had been coming to this cafe every Tuesday morning for the past decade, always sitting at that same table where they had their first date 60 years ago. "Please, sir," Jenny whispered, her voice barely audible. "They're regular customers too, and they were here first." Richard slammed his hand on the counter, making the cash register jump. "Do you know who I am? I'm Richard Blackwell. I own half this neighborhood, and soon I'll own this pathetic little cafe too. When I want my table, I get my table." The entire cafe fell silent. Customers stared down at their coffee cups, afraid to meet his gaze. The owner, Frank Rodriguez, emerged from the kitchen but stopped when he saw Richard. Frank knew better than to challenge him. Richard had been making his life miserable for months, trying to force him to sell the cafe so he could tear it down and build another one of his luxury condominiums. Mrs. Peterson's eyes filled with tears as her husband slowly stood up, his arthritic hands shaking as he reached for his walker. "Come on, Martha," he said quietly. "We'll find another table." "That's right, old man," Richard sneered. "Know your place." The humiliation hung in the air like smoke. Everyone watched as the elderly couple shuffled away from their beloved corner table, their heads down in shame. It was a scene that played out too often at Maple Street Café. Richard Blackwell came in, demanded whatever he wanted, and everyone cowered before his wealth and influence. But not today. "Excuse me, sir." The voice was clear, confident, and unfamiliar. Everyone turned to see a young black woman in her mid-20s walking toward Richard. She wore the cafe's standard uniform, a simple white shirt and black apron, but carried herself with a dignity that commanded attention. Her name tag read Keisha. Richard looked her up and down with disgust. "Who are you supposed to be?" "I'm Keisha Williams, and I'm the new waitress here," she said calmly, standing tall despite being nearly a foot shorter than him. "And I believe you owe that couple an apology." The cafe gasped. In 3 years of Richard's reign of terror, no one had ever stood up to him. Not the customers, not the staff, not even the owner. But here was this young woman, barely out of college by the look of her, challenging the most feared man in the neighborhood. Richard's face turned red. "Are you out of your mind? Do you know who you're talking to?" "I know exactly who I'm talking to," Keisha replied, her voice steady. "I'm talking to a man who just bullied 2 elderly people out of their seat because he thinks his money makes him better than everyone else." "My money does make me better than everyone else," Richard roared. "Especially some little girl who probably can't even afford to eat in a place like this if she wasn't serving the food." Keisha didn't flinch. Instead, she smiled, a calm, knowing smile that seemed to unnerve Richard more than any angry response could have. "You know what I see when I look at you, Mr. Blackwell," she said, walking closer. "I see a man who has so little respect for himself that he has to tear down others to feel important. I see someone so empty inside that he fills that emptiness with cruelty instead of kindness." The cafe was dead silent. Even the coffee machine seemed to stop humming. Richard's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, completely caught off guard by her response. I'll have you fired, he sputtered. I'll make sure you never work anywhere in this city again. Go ahead, Keisha said, untying her apron. But before you do, let me tell you something about myself. You see, Mr. Blackwell, you're not the only successful person in this room. She folded her apron neatly and placed it on the nearest table. My name is Keisha Williams, and I have a master's degree in business administration from Stanford University. I spent the last 3 years working at Goldman Sachs, making more money than most people see in a lifetime. Richard's expression began to change from anger to confusion. Then what are you doing working as a waitress? Because, Keisha said, her voice growing stronger, 6 months ago, my little brother was diagnosed with leukemia. He's 8 years old, and he needs me more than any job ever could. So I moved back home to take care of him and help my mother, who works 2 jobs just to keep our family afloat. The cafe seemed to hold its breath as Keisha continued. I took this job not because I had to, but because I wanted to. Because this cafe represents something beautiful, a place where neighbors become family, where Mr. Peterson proposed to Mrs. Peterson 60 years ago, where single mothers bring their children for pancakes on Sunday mornings, and where teenagers come to study for exams because they don't have quiet spaces at home. She gestured around the room. You see weakness and poverty, Mr. Blackwell. I see strength and community. You see people to exploit. I see people worth protecting. Richard opened his mouth to respond, but Keisha wasn't finished. You want to know what real success looks like? It's Mrs. Chen over there. She pointed to an Asian woman in her 60s, who came to this country with nothing and built a successful tailoring business while raising 4 children who all became doctors and teachers. It's Tommy behind the counter, who's working his way through nursing school while supporting his disabled father. It's Mr. Rodriguez, who took his grandmother's recipes and built this cafe into a place where everyone feels welcome, regardless of their bank account. Richard looked around the room, seeing the faces of people he had dismissed and intimidated for years. For the first time, he seemed to really see them. You think your money makes you powerful, Keisha continued, but real power is lifting others up, not tearing them down. Real strength is protecting those who can't protect themselves, not bullying them because you can. She walked over to the Petersons, who were still standing uncertainly by another table. Mr. and Mrs. Peterson, please go back to your table. This is your home, and no one has the right to take that away from you. The elderly couple looked nervously at Richard, then back at Keisha. Slowly, Mrs. Peterson smiled through her tears. Thank you, dear, she whispered. As the Petersons made their way back to their corner booth, something extraordinary happened. One by one, other customers began to stand up. Mrs. Chen nodded respectfully at Keisha. Tommy came out from behind the counter and started clapping. Soon, the entire cafe was applauding. Richard stood in the middle of it all, looking smaller than anyone had ever seen him. The applause wasn't for him. It was for a young woman who had shown more courage in 5 minutes than all of them had shown in 3 years. This is ridiculous, Richard muttered, but his voice lacked its usual venom. He looked around the room one more time, his eyes lingering on the faces of people he had never really seen before. Without another word, he turned and walked toward the door. But as his hand touched the handle, he stopped. Slowly, he turned back around. The little boy, he said quietly, looking at Keisha. Your brother. What kind of leukemia? Keisha was surprised by the question. Acute lymphoblastic leukemia. He's been in treatment for 6 months. Richard nodded slowly. St. Mary's Hospital. Yes, sir. For a long moment, Richard stood there, his expensive suit suddenly looking like a costume he was tired of wearing. My daughter, he said, so quietly that only the people nearest him could hear, died of leukemia when she was 7. 23 years ago. The cafe fell silent again, but this time it was different. This wasn't the fearful silence they were used to. This was the silence of recognition, of understanding, of shared humanity. I'm sorry for your loss, Keisha said gently. Richard's eyes filled with tears, the first time anyone in the cafe had seen him show any emotion other than anger. After she died, I threw myself into work, into making money. I told myself that if I was rich enough, powerful enough, I could control everything. I could make sure nothing bad ever happened again. He looked around the room with different eyes. But I couldn't control anything, could I? I just became angry. At everyone. At the world. At God. At myself. Mrs. Peterson, who had been listening from her corner booth, slowly stood up and walked over to Richard. This tiny woman, who had been terrified of him just minutes before, reached out and gently touched his arm. "What was her name?" she asked softly. "Sarah," Richard whispered. "Her name was Sarah." "Sarah is a beautiful name," Mrs. Peterson said. "My grandmother's name was Sarah. She used to tell me that people named Sarah were born to bring light to the world, even when their time was short." Richard broke down completely then, sobbing in a way that seemed to release 23 years of buried grief and anger. The transformation was stunning to witness. The feared millionaire who had terrorized them all was revealed to be a broken father who had never learned how to grieve. Frank Rodriguez stepped forward, offering Richard a chair and a cup of coffee. "On the house," he said simply. Richard looked up at him through his tears. "I've been trying to buy this place so I could tear it down. I've been making your life hell for months." "I know," Frank said, "but everyone deserves a second chance." Over the next hour, something beautiful happened in Maple Street Café. Richard sat at a regular table, not the corner booth, and for the first time in years, he had a real conversation. Mrs. Chen told him about her journey to America. Tommy shared his dreams of becoming a pediatric nurse. The Petersons showed him pictures of their grandchildren. And Keisha sat across from him, telling him about her brother Marcus, how brave he was, how he never complained during chemotherapy, how he wanted to be a scientist when he grew up so he could find cures for diseases. "There's an experimental treatment," Richard said suddenly, "at Johns Hopkins. I've been funding research there. In Sarah's name. Your brother might be eligible." Keisha's eyes widened. "Mr. Blackwell, I couldn't ask you to." "You're not asking," Richard said firmly. "I'm offering. It's what Sarah would have wanted. It's what I should have been doing all along instead of this." He gestured at himself with disgust. "Why?" Keisha asked. "After everything that happened today, why would you help us?" Richard looked around the cafe, really looked at it. He saw the photos on the walls of regular customers celebrating birthdays and anniversaries. He saw the community bulletin board covered with thank you notes and local announcements. He saw the jar by the register collecting donations for a local family whose house had burned down. "Because you showed me something today that I had forgotten," he said. "You showed me what it means to be human. What it means to care about something bigger than yourself." He stood up and pulled out his wallet, but instead of the arrogant display of wealth everyone expected, he quietly left a $20 bill for his coffee and walked over to the donation jar. Without fanfare, he pulled out a check and dropped it in. Later, when Frank looked at the check, it was for $10,000. But Richard wasn't done. Over the following weeks, he became a regular at Maple Street Café, not as the feared millionaire, but as Richard, a man learning how to be part of a community. He arranged for Marcus to be admitted to the experimental program at Johns Hopkins, where the treatment was showing remarkable success. He also quietly withdrew his offers to buy the cafe and instead became its largest investor, helping Frank expand the business while keeping its community feel. He set up a scholarship fund for students like Tommy who were working their way through school. He established a senior citizen program that provided free meals for elderly customers who couldn't afford them. Most importantly, he learned to listen. He spent hours talking with Mrs. Peterson about her late husband's war stories. He helped Mrs. Chen with the business plan for expanding her tailoring shop. He became a mentor to Tommy, sharing his business knowledge while learning about compassion from a young man who chose nursing over more lucrative careers because he wanted to help people. And with Keisha, he formed an unlikely friendship. She taught him that true strength came from vulnerability, not dominance. He taught her about business strategy and eventually offered to pay for her to get her MBA. though she insisted on earning it part-time while continuing to care for Marcus. 6 months later, Marcus was in remission. The experimental treatment had worked better than anyone had hoped. At the celebration dinner held at Maple Street Café, Marcus ran up to Richard and hugged him tightly. "Thank you for helping me get better," the 8-year-old said simply. Richard knelt down to Marcus's level, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "Thank you for helping me get better too, buddy." As Richard looked around the cafe that night, at the faces of people who had become his friends, at the community he had almost destroyed, at the young woman who had saved his soul, he understood something profound. He had spent years trying to buy respect, to purchase power, to own his way out of pain. But Keisha Williams, a waitress making minimum wage, had shown him that the most valuable things in life couldn't be bought. They had to be earned through kindness, built through service, and shared through love. The corner booth where Mr. and Mrs. Peterson sat every Tuesday morning became a symbol of something larger. It represented the idea that everyone deserves a place at the table, that dignity isn't determined by wealth, and that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stand up for what's right, even when you're afraid. Years later, when people talked about the day everything changed at Maple Street Café, they would remember different details. Some remembered Richard's tears. Others remembered Mrs. Peterson's kindness. Many remembered the standing ovation. But everyone remembered Keisha Williams, the young black waitress who looked fear in the face and chose courage instead. Who saw a bully and chose to see a broken human being. Who proved that real power comes not from tearing others down, but from lifting them up. The cafe still stands today, busier than ever. Richard's photo hangs on the wall next to all the other community members. Not because he was wealthy, but because he learned to be kind. Marcus, now cancer-free and in high school, volunteers there on weekends. Tommy graduated nursing school and works in the pediatric ward where Marcus was once a patient. And Keisha? She finished her MBA and opened her own consulting firm, specializing in helping small businesses grow while maintaining their community values. But she still stops by the cafe every morning before work, not as a waitress, but as family. Because that's what Maple Street Café has always been about. Not the perfect coffee or the best prices, but the simple, revolutionary idea that everyone matters, everyone has dignity, and everyone deserves respect. Sometimes it takes just one person to stand up and remind us all of our shared humanity. Sometimes that person is a young woman with nothing but courage and compassion. Sometimes the greatest victories happen not in boardrooms or courtrooms, but in small cafes where ordinary people do extraordinary things. Everyone in the cafe had feared the rude millionaire. But thanks to the new black waitress who stood up to him, they learned that fear was just another word for forgotten hope. And hope, once remembered, changes everything. Did this story touch your heart? Do you believe in the power of standing up for what's right, even when it's scary? Subscribe to Beyond Yesterday YouTube channel for more inspiring stories that remind us of the best of human nature. Because every day is a chance to choose courage over fear, kindness over cruelty, and hope over despair. Hit that subscribe button and join our community of people who believe that one person really can make a difference.